Chosen one, listen. You were taught to wait, taught to stand still while heaven moved pieces around you. Taught that destiny descends, arrives fully formed, and you simply step into it when the signal appears. But that story was incomplete. What if God was never asking you to wait in silence but to build in secret? What if the future you keep praying for is already under construction, not somewhere above you, but within you? This is the disruption you feel but couldn't name. The restlessness, the sense that watching for signs is no longer enough, the quiet discomfort with passive faith. Because being chosen was never about exemption from effort. It was about authorization. God did not choose you to remain empty while heaven works alone. God chose you as a living structure, a site of ongoing construction, a place where intention becomes form. That inner pressure you feel is not confusion. It is framing being installed. Those recurring thoughts are not distractions, they are measurements. Those repeated lessons are not punishment, they are reinforcements. You weren't meant to outsource your becoming. Divine timing is not a pause button on your life. It is a synchronization between who you are becoming and what you are meant to carry. This is why waiting started to feel wrong, because the season shifted from expectation to participation. The future is not approaching you from a distance. It is assembling itself through your choices, your awareness, your inner alignment right now. And once you see this, you can never unsee it. You are not behind, you are not forgotten, you are not early. You are under construction by design. You are under construction by design. That was the final truth you were left holding. And if you're honest, it unsettled you, because it contradicts the story you were given. You were taught that being chosen would be obvious, that it would announce itself through signs, confirmations, dramatic turns of fate, that at some point the sky would split, the path would light up, and certainty would arrive fully formed. But your life didn't follow that script. Instead, you were met with silence, with obscurity, with long stretches where nothing seemed to happen, at least nothing anyone else could see. And quietly, without realizing it, you began to question whether you were chosen at all. Here is the inversion you were never told. If your calling were external, it would need constant reinforcement. If your destiny depended on spectacle, it would collapse the moment the noise stopped. But what God builds to last is not announced, it is rooted. The chosen ones were never marked by visibility. They were marked by internal disturbance, a pressure that wouldn't leave, a sense of misalignment with ordinary scripts, a recurring awareness that your life could not be reduced to survival routine or surface success. You didn't hear a voice, you felt an echo, and that's where most people get lost. They keep looking outward for what was always meant to awaken inward. They wait for permission that was already encoded into them. They confuse silence with absence when silence was the environment required for construction. God does not compete with noise. God works in depth. This is why your path didn't look impressive early on, why your growth felt hidden, why your transformation happened internally while your external life lagged behind. You were being insulated because a calling that depends on applause will fracture under responsibility, and a destiny built on visibility will collapse under pressure. You weren't being ignored. You were being shielded from premature exposure. That ache you carry, the sense that something about you never fit cleanly into systems, roles, or expectations, that was not rebellion. It was architectural incompatibility. You were never designed to be plugged into prefabricated lives. And here's the uncomfortable truth most people never confront. If God had shown you the full scope of what you were meant to become early on, you would have tried to perform it instead of becoming it. So the work began quietly, in patterns, in repetition, in subtle internal shifts you couldn't fully explain to anyone else. This is why your journey feels lonely, not because you are abandoned, but because internal callings are not crowd experiences. They isolate you until your identity is stable enough to withstand influence. You were not chosen to follow a path already paved. You were chosen to recognize one forming beneath your feet, and recognition requires stillness. This is the moment where the narrative changes. You stop asking, why hasn't it happened yet? And you start asking, what has been forming in me this whole time? Because the evidence was never outside you. It was always in the repetition of your thoughts, the themes that keep returning, the inner tensions that refuse to resolve. The calling was not missing, it was whispering. The calling was whispering. That was the last truth you were left with. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If it was whispering, why didn't you hear it sooner? Because you were listening the way you were taught to listen, for volume, for interruption, for something that would overpower your doubts instead of exposing them. But the calling does not shout over your life. It threads itself through it. It returns, again and again, in different forms, different seasons, different disguises. Not to impress you, but to test whether you recognize resonance. This is where discernment begins, not with a moment, but with a pattern. You notice certain thoughts that won't dissolve with time, certain questions that don't fade no matter how busy you stay, certain tensions that resurface even after you try to move on. That is not indecision. That is insistence. The calling speaks through repetition because repetition reveals identity. What belongs to you returns. What is imposed eventually leaves. This is why the whisper survived distraction, exhaustion, disappointment, even denial. It didn't argue with you. It waited. You mistook it for imagination, for curiosity, for restlessness. But imagination fades when pressure arrives. Curiosity moves on. Restlessness scatters. This did not. It stayed when you tried to silence it. It followed you into new chapters. It adapted when your circumstances changed. That is how you know it is not a fantasy. The whisper is not emotional. It is consistent. It doesn't beg for attention. It doesn't rush you. It doesn't explain itself. It simply aligns with who you are when you stop performing. And that is why it terrified you. Because the whisper doesn't ask you to add something new to your life. It asks you to subtract what isn't true. When you slow down enough to hear it, something becomes clear. Your calling is not separate from your nature. It is embedded in it. It shows up in what drains you and what restores you, in what you instinctively protect, in what you notice when others don't, in what feels heavy when you ignore it and lighter when you honor it. This is not random. God does not encode purpose in contradiction. He hides it in familiarity so deep you mistake it for normal. You thought everyone felt this way. Everyone carried this tension. Everyone sensed this pull. They don't. That assumption kept you from claiming what was yours. The whisper sharpened as your external certainty weakened. When plans collapsed, when old identities stopped working, when validation lost its power, not to punish you, but because noise was finally clearing. The calling waits for honesty. It does not reveal itself to the version of you that wants comfort. It reveals itself to the version of you that is willing to stand exposed. That is why it intensified during solitude, during disappointment, during moments you couldn't distract yourself. It was never absent. You were just unavailable. And now that you're listening, something subtle but irreversible is happening. You're no longer asking, is this real? You're asking, why has this always been here? Because whispers are not meant to convince you. They are meant to be recognized. And once recognized, they don't let go. They begin to organize your inner world. They start rearranging priorities. They quietly dismantle false paths without announcing the demolition. This is where the calling moves from sound to structure, from intuition to architecture, from whisper to blueprint. That was the shift you felt at the end. Because once something has structure, it can no longer be dismissed as coincidence. A whisper can be ignored. A pattern cannot. And now you begin to see something unsettling and strangely relieving at the same time. Your life was not a collection of random interests, wounds, and abilities. It was a layout. What you called personality was actually positioning. What you called talent was structural capacity. What you called struggle was load-bearing reinforcement. Nothing essential about you is accidental. You were given a specific spiritual DNA. Not just gifts, but tensions. Not just strengths, but sensitivities. Not just passions, but limits. And you spent years trying to correct them. You tried to flatten what made you intense. You tried to mute what made you perceptive. You tried to outgrow what made you feel too much, think too deeply, or notice what others overlooked. But those traits were not flaws. They were measurements. God does not build futures generically. He builds them to specification, which is why your design didn't match the templates around you. Why advice often felt misaligned. Why paths that worked for others felt draining or hollow when you tried to walk them. You weren't resisting growth. You were resisting misplacement. Your passions weren't hobbies waiting to be justified. They were indicators of where your energy naturally flows. Your curiosities weren't distractions. They were windows into the kind of problems you are wired to engage. Even your struggles, the ones you begged God to remove, were shaping capacity. Pressure reveals weak points so they can be reinforced. Weight is not added to collapse a structure, but to test its integrity. This reframes everything. The sensitivity that once felt like a liability, it trained discernment. The isolation that felt unfair, it cultivated internal reference instead of dependence on noise. The repeated cycles that embarrassed you, they were teaching mastery through familiarity. You were not failing lessons. You were being trained through repetition until instinct replaced effort. And here is where the unseen architecture becomes undeniable. You keep encountering the same themes, the same types of conversations, the same kinds of people, the same moral tensions, the same questions about meaning, integrity, responsibility, truth. Different settings, same core material. That is not coincidence. That is a blueprint revealing itself through recurrence. God speaks through continuity. What returns is not punishment, it is invitation. Invitation to stop treating your life as a series of detours and start reading it as intentional design. Even the things you wish had gone differently were not wasted. Nothing that refined you was unnecessary. Nothing that deepened you was excess. If a future is meant to hold weight, the inner structure must be reinforced first. This is why shortcuts never satisfied you. Why surface success felt empty. Why external rewards couldn't quiet the internal insistence. Your soul was not designed for thin outcomes. And now the question quietly shifts. Not why am I like this, but what is this building toward? Because once you recognize design, responsibility enters. A blueprint is not a guarantee. It is a guide. It shows what can be built, not what will be built without participation. You begin to realize something sobering. God trusted you with raw materials, with inclination, with capacity. But construction requires consent. And this is where most people retreat, because it is easier to call your nature a burden than to accept it as an assignment. Easier to ask God to change you than to ask what He is building through you. But the moment you stop resisting, your design alignment begins, not externally yet, internally. Pieces click into place, confusion gives way to coherence. Your past stops arguing with your future. You don't have the full picture, but you finally have the framework. And frameworks don't demand speed. They demand precision. You finally have the framework. And once you see it, your past stops feeling random. Because a framework doesn't only point forward, it reaches backward. You begin to notice how the structure didn't start forming when you became aware of it. It started long before you had language for it. Moments you thought were detours suddenly align. Seasons you labeled as wasted begin to reveal their function, not as explanations, as connections. You start to see how certain experiences trained you in ways comfort never could. How specific disappointments stripped illusions you would later need gone. How certain relationships exposed limits you were never meant to cross again. Nothing was isolated. The unseen architect does not work in fragments. He works in systems. What felt like loss was often separation. What felt like delay was recalibration. What felt like repeated failure was familiarity being forged. You didn't just survive those seasons. You were being calibrated by them. Because the future you are meant to carry cannot be held by an untested interior. This is the part people misunderstand. Redemption does not mean pain was good. It means pain was used. There is a difference. You were not harmed on purpose, but what harmed you did not escape purpose. The experiences that cut deepest often carve the widest internal space. They created rooms others don't have access to. Perspective others cannot fake. This is why you can sit with complexity without panicking. Why you sense undercurrents others miss. Why surface-level answers feel insufficient to you. Your past didn't just happen to you. It prepared you to hold something. And the connections become impossible to ignore. The skills you developed out of necessity now serve insight. The resilience you learned in isolation now supports leadership. The discernment you earned through disappointment now protects integrity. You weren't collecting scars. You are accumulating structural integrity. This reframes even the moments you regret, the times you stayed too long, the choices you made before you were ready, the versions of yourself you wish you could erase. Those versions taught you what alignment feels like by contrast. They taught you what happens when you ignore your internal signals, what it costs to abandon your nature, what misalignment does to the soul over time. You learned it firsthand so you wouldn't have to guess later. God does not erase the past to build the future. He integrates it. Every layer added, every fracture repaired, every reinforcement placed where collapse once threatened. This is why your story has depth. Why shallow narratives don't resonate. Why simple answers feel dishonest. Why you crave coherence instead of comfort. You were never meant to deny where you've been. You were meant to understand it. Understanding creates stability. Stability creates authority. And authority changes how you move forward. Because once your past stops fighting your future, your energy stops leaking into regret. You stop trying to outrun who you were. You stop apologizing for the path that shaped you. You begin to carry it with clarity. And clarity is power, not the loud kind, the grounded kind. The kind that doesn't need validation because it knows where it came from. This is where something shifts internally. You realize you're not waiting to be chosen anymore. You're being asked to own what you've been entrusted with. And ownership brings weight, because once you see the design behind your life, you can no longer claim ignorance. You don't just know that something is being built. You begin to sense that it's time to step closer to the work itself, not as an observer, but as a participant. You are being asked to step closer to the work itself. And this is where everything becomes uncomfortable, because participation removes excuses. Up until now, you could tell yourself you were waiting for clarity, waiting for confirmation, waiting for something outside you to authorize what you already sensed inside. But ownership changes the posture. Ownership says, this is mine to steward. And the moment that thought settles in, a quiet fear surfaces. What if you're wrong? What if you misread it? What if you claim authority you were never meant to carry? That fear feels like humility, but often it is avoidance wearing spiritual language. Because humility does not deny responsibility, it accepts it with care. You were never meant to live by external validation. Signs fade, applause shifts. Systems change their standards without warning. If your sense of direction depends on being affirmed, you will be endlessly adjustable and internally fragmented. This is why your life kept stripping away outside certainty. Why mentors disappointed you. Why institutions fell short. Why advice conflicted. Not because guidance is useless, but because reliance had to be recalibrated. God was not removing support. He was relocating authority. From out there to in here. This is what reclaiming inherent power actually means. Not control, not dominance, not ego, alignment. When your inner world stops arguing with itself, your actions gain coherence. When you trust what has been shaped within you, you stop outsourcing decisions to fear. This is why alignment feels so different from motivation. Motivation spikes and crashes. Alignment sustains. Alignment doesn't need hype, it needs honesty. Honesty about what drains you. Honesty about what energizes you. Honesty about what you can no longer pretend is fine. You begin to notice how inner shifts ripple outward. Small boundaries create unexpected peace. Minor course corrections open disproportionate doors. Saying no to misaligned paths creates space you didn't know you needed. This is the internal to external shift most people never make. They try to change outcomes without changing orientation. They want new results without new alignment. But the future responds to who you are becoming, not who you are pretending to be. This is where limiting beliefs begin to surface, not gently, but insistently. Stories you absorbed about your capacity. Narratives that told you to stay smaller, quieter, safer. Rules that made obedience feel like disappearance. Those beliefs were never neutral. They shaped what you allowed yourself to imagine, pursue, or claim. And now they resist dismantling. Because dismantling them means responsibility increases. When you stop telling yourself you're not ready, you have to ask what readiness actually requires. When you stop waiting for permission, you have to decide how you will wield what you carry. Authority is heavy. This is why many people prefer external signs. They relieve you of agency. But being chosen was never about being spared weight. It was about being trusted with it, and trust demands integrity. You begin to feel it now, a tightening, a seriousness. The sense that this is no longer theoretical, no longer inspirational. Something in you knows that alignment will cost you. Comfort, familiar approval, old identities that kept you safe. This is the point where inner certainty stops feeling empowering and starts feeling sobering. Because clarity eliminates plausible deniability. Once you know what no longer fits continuing to wear, it becomes a choice. And choices accumulate consequences. You are no longer asking, am I chosen? You are asking, am I willing to live as someone who is? And that question does not rush you, but it does not leave you alone. You are no longer asking if you are chosen. You are asking what it will cost to live as if you are. And that question inevitably collides with time. Because the moment you accept responsibility, impatience sharpens. You want movement, evidence, momentum that matches the clarity forming inside you. But time does not accelerate for clarity alone. This is where many misinterpret God's timing. They think delay means refusal, that silence signals disapproval, that if it hasn't moved yet, it must not be meant. But construction does not rush because desire appears. Readiness is not about enthusiasm, it is about capacity. You don't pour weight onto a foundation that hasn't cured. You don't open a structure before its supports are tested. And you don't release responsibility before identity is stable. Divine timing is not about waiting long enough. It is about becoming able. This is why progress in your life has felt uneven. Moments of acceleration followed by pauses. Breakthroughs followed by stretches of stillness. Insights arriving faster than outcomes. It wasn't inconsistency. It was sequencing. Your inner world was being expanded to hold what your outer life will eventually express. This is where patience becomes purposeful. Not passive endurance, active refinement. Every delay asks a question. Is this part of you ready to carry what you're asking for? If not, time becomes a tool instead of a punishment. Time exposes weak attachments. Time reveals misaligned motives. Time clarifies whether you want the outcome or the transformation required to sustain it. This is why shortcuts never lasted for you. Why doors that opened too early felt wrong. Why opportunities arrived before you could accept them fully. They weren't mistakes. They were mirrors, showing you what still needed strengthening. Inner work creates a butterfly effect most people underestimate. A single shift in self-trust recalibrates dozens of decisions. A boundary reshapes entire relational ecosystems. One honest choice alters long-term trajectories. But those shifts require integration, and integration cannot be rushed. This is where surrender is misunderstood. Surrender is not resignation, it is cooperation with process. You stop forcing timelines that would collapse you later. You stop envying paths you are not built to sustain. You stop interpreting delay as judgment. You let becoming catch up with vision. This is the sacred tension. You know what you are meant for, but you also know you are still becoming someone who can carry it without distortion. That knowing is uncomfortable, because part of you wants arrival, and part of you knows arrival too early would fracture integrity. So time stretches, not to torment you, to protect you. Every season of apparent stagnation is asking for embodiment. Not more planning, not more imagining, but deeper alignment. How do you speak when no one is watching? How do you choose when it costs you? How do you handle power in small doses? These questions are answered quietly, daily, and visibly, and the answers accumulate. One day without spectacle, you realize something has changed. You are no longer pushing, you are positioned, and positioning does not announce itself. It simply holds. This is when timing shifts, not because you demanded it, but because the structure could finally bear weight. You are not late. You are being prepared to last. You are being prepared to last. That was the final claim resting on you. And if you listen closely, you can feel how quiet that preparation has been. No announcements, no witnesses, no dramatic markers, just subtle internal movements that seemed too small to matter at the time. But this is how real momentum begins, not with visibility, but with orientation. When alignment settles in something, changes beneath the surface. Your reactions soften, your decisions simplify, your tolerance for misalignment disappears. And none of this looks impressive from the outside. That's the paradox. The most consequential shifts in your life were not public victories. They were internal corrections, moments you chose restraint instead of reaction, moments you honored a boundary no one applauded, moments you told the truth when it cost you convenience. Each one felt minor, but each one adjusted the trajectory. This is the butterfly effect of inner work. A single act of self-trust alters how you speak, which alters how others respond, which alters the roles you're invited into, which alters the responsibilities you're given, all from a decision no one saw. You underestimated these moments because they didn't feel powerful. But power does not announce itself at inception. It accumulates. You were taught to look for transformation in outcomes, but God measures transformation in orientation. Once your inner world stops contradicting itself, your life stops scattering energy. You notice it now. You waste less time explaining yourself. You move with fewer words. You sense when to engage and when to withdraw. Not because you're detached, because you're centered. This is where invisibility becomes an advantage. While others were performing, you were integrating. While others were chasing clarity through exposure, you were stabilizing identity through silence. And stability creates gravity. People begin to respond to you differently without knowing why. Opportunities feel less forced. Resistance diminishes in places that once blocked you, not because you became louder, because you became coherent. This is what happens when inner alignment reaches a critical mass. The world starts to adjust around you, not dramatically, incrementally. And that incremental shift compounds. This is why you couldn't rush this phase, because influence that emerges before coherence becomes manipulation. Impact without integration collapses under pressure, but impact rooted in alignment multiplies without strain. You didn't just change internally, you changed the field you move through. Your presence carries less noise and more signal. Your words land with weight instead of volume. Your decisions ripple outward with unintended consequence. You see it in small confirmations, conversations that open unexpectedly, doors that no longer resist, people responding to you as if they sense something has settled. They're not imagining it. Something has. The structure within you is no longer shifting under its own weight. And now momentum builds not explosively, but steadily. This is the dangerous phase for the unprepared. Because when movement begins quietly, it's tempting to dismiss it, to delay engagement, to assume it's coincidence. But you know better now. You've learned how patterns form, how whispers become blueprints, how blueprints become structures. And now the structure is influencing reality, which means neutrality is no longer an option. Because momentum demands direction. If you don't choose where to stand, movement will carry you by default. This is where inner work becomes visible, not through performance, but through consequence. Your choices matter more now. Your integrity weighs heavier. Your misalignment would cost more than it once did. Because once momentum exists, it amplifies whatever you attach to it. This is the threshold most people never reach. They confuse being unseen with being unimportant. They abandon the process before the shift compounds. You didn't. You stayed long enough for invisibility to turn into leverage. And now the question ahead is no longer about readiness. It's about direction. Because what is moving will not stop on its own. It will follow what you align it with. And alignment at this stage is no longer internal alone. It begins to demand embodiment. Alignment is no longer internal alone. That was the line you crossed without ceremony. Because once momentum begins, inner truth starts asking for a body. This is where many retreat. They loved alignment when it was private. They honored clarity when it stayed theoretical. They trusted the process as long as it didn't require visible change. But embodiment removes ambiguity. You cannot carry what you now know without consequence. The moment alignment seeks expression, you face a compression of choice. Either you allow what has been built within you to shape your actions, or you fracture yourself by pretending nothing has changed. There is no middle ground here, because you are no longer forming a vision, you are forming signal. The chosen one was never meant to be a spectator of destiny. You were always meant to be a co-creator, not replacing God, participating with Him. Your role is not to force outcomes, it is to agree with what has been formed in you and act accordingly. This is where faith becomes tangible, not belief, Behavior. You begin to notice how small decisions now carry disproportionate weight. What you tolerate speaks louder. What you decline reveals more. What you choose to engage with defines the architecture you're standing inside. This is where integrity becomes non-negotiable. Because power that moves through misalignment turns corrosive, influence without embodiment turns hollow. Insight without obedience becomes arrogance. You feel the pressure now not from fear, but from coherence. You can't unknow what you know. You can't pretend neutrality. You can't go back to passive waiting. This is why certain environments feel intolerable now, why certain conversations exhaust you, why certain compromises feel heavier than they used to. You're not becoming rigid, you're becoming precise. Precision is costly. It asks you to live what you carry instead of hiding behind intention. It asks you to let your values inconvenience you. It asks you to accept that alignment will cost you access, approval, and ease. This is where co-creation reveals its price. God supplies vision and capacity. You supply consent and action, and consent is not a feeling. It is demonstrated through movement. You don't need a dramatic overhaul. You need congruence, where your words match your posture, where your decisions match your insight, where your silence matches your values. This is how the ordained path manifests, not through spectacle, but through daily embodiment that quietly reorganizes reality around you. You stop asking, what am I meant to do someday? And start asking, what does alignment require today? That question simplifies everything. Because destiny is not built in grand moments. It is built in consistent agreement between inner truth and outer action. And now you sense the final shift approaching. Because when embodiment stabilizes, your life stops being about you alone. What you carry begins to affect others. Your alignment becomes a reference point. Your choices become permission. Your presence becomes disturbance or invitation. This is where responsibility expands beyond self, and there is no returning to anonymity. Because once alignment takes form, it doesn't just move your life forward, it sends a signal. It sends a signal. That is what you stepped into the moment embodiment stabilized. Because alignment never stays contained. What forms within you does not end with you. This is the weight most people never consider when they ask to be chosen. They imagine elevation. They imagine clarity. They imagine purpose as a private reward. But alignment was never meant to terminate at self. It radiates. Your life becomes a reference point, not because you announce it, but because coherence is recognizable. People feel it before they understand it. They sense it before they name it. Your presence begins to disturb familiar patterns, not aggressively, not intentionally. Simply by being aligned, you expose misalignment around you. This is why reactions change. Some feel drawn, some feel unsettled, some resist without knowing why. It's not personal, it's structural. When a stable structure enters a weak system, pressure reveals cracks. This is the ripple effect. Not influence through persuasion, but influence through example. You give others permission without saying a word. Permission to question, permission to pause, permission to stop living divided. This is how awakening actually spreads. Not through mass moments, but through singular lives that refuse fragmentation. You were never meant to save anyone, but you were meant to signal. Signal what alignment looks like when it's lived, not spoken. Signal what integrity feels like when it costs something. Signal that another way of being is possible. This is why responsibility increases at this stage. Because what you tolerate now teaches others what is acceptable. What you normalize becomes contagious. What you embody quietly authorizes imitation. This is sobering, because it means there is no neutral way to carry what you carry. Your choices echo further than they used to. Your compromises would ripple wider. Your integrity would stabilize more than just your own life. This is the part rarely mentioned. Being chosen is not about standing out. It is about standing true when others are watching and when they are not. Your life becomes a living architecture others walk through unconsciously. They feel the weight of it, the coherence of it, the peace or the tension it carries. And whether you like it or not, it affects them. This is why retreat is no longer an option. Not because you owe the world performance, but because alignment once embodied becomes stewardship. You don't get to disappear back into anonymity, not fully, Because the unseen architect didn't build you for isolation, he built you as a load-bearing structure in a larger design. You don't see the whole city yet. You don't know where every path leads, but you know this. What has been built within you was never just for you. It was meant to hold weight. It was meant to be entered. It was meant to last. And now the final responsibility settles in. Not to impress, not to convince, but to remain aligned. Because alignment is the signal, and the signal is already moving. This is where we leave you, chosen one. Not with noise, not with urgency, but with weight that settles instead of agitates. You don't need to do anything dramatic after this. No declarations, no announcements, no performance. The unseen architect does not rush finishing touches. What matters now is how you stand. You've seen that your life was never random, that what felt delayed was being prepared, that what formed in silence was meant to endure pressure. So let it endure. Let the structure within you finish setting. Let your choices continue to align quietly. Let your days reflect what has already been built. You don't need to convince anyone of who you are becoming. Structures don't argue, they simply hold. There will be moments when you're tempted to rush ahead to explain yourself, to seek confirmation again. When that happens, remember this. If something was built from within, it will stand without defense. Your task is not to expand faster. It is to remain true longer. Alignment is not proven in moments of inspiration. It is proven in consistency, in restraint, in choosing integrity when no one would know if you didn't. This is how the work continues now. Not upward, inward and outward at the same time. You will notice fewer words are needed, fewer reactions, fewer explanations. And in that quiet, you'll sense it clearly. The future you were waiting for is no longer ahead of you. It is moving through you. So remain where you are. Stand where you've been positioned. Carry what you've been entrusted with. The unseen architect is not finished, but the foundation is set. And what is built on truth does not collapse.